So who am I? Well, my name's Martin Ewert. I'm seconded to the Gates Foundation coming from Procter & Gamble. And you might ask on kind of what's somebody doing who's normally selling Pampers, Pantene, Head and Shoulders, and I don't go through all the brands in there, but a lot of those, to do with some drug supply chains in there. Well, a lot in there. And one thing is, what we think I can learn on everybody in this room is complexity. When you look at the supply chain in commercial terms in Africa, you actually talk like 500,000 pickup points in Nigeria, 500,000. So at 500,000 points in the country, we're trying to sell our products. Not easy to reach. Or in a country like South Africa, it's plus 100,000, a big complexity to handle with. In terms of SKUs, you normally talk like 2,000, 3,000 plus SKUs in a country in the context of a commercial supply chain. And the days to deliver and the days that you hold in hand is maybe 10% of what we normally have in public health, where for most of the countries, holding 2 years of inventory is still quite standard. Less than that is great, but we find a lot of places where you hold actually more than 2 years in there, with all the problems that come along in there. Now, this is why a company like P&G would not be able to operate without a van or control tower, as we learned this morning in there. So part of my role working for the Gates Foundation in the last 2 years is really to identify what are the things, the nuggets that we have in private sector that would make sense in public health in there. And there are a lot, as you will hear today. Today is also, to me, a little bit of the South Africa Day. When we started planning for the conference, I said, like, well, we have to do it in South Africa. There's so many great examples. And as I said last night, it's a great country, great people, but also great solutions on public health supply chain in there. And the next two speakers will help us to understand on what's going on there. To me, VAN is also three things. One, understand today, and we heard a lot about that during the panel. Second, tomorrow, and that's maybe the post-mortem. You don't want to be part of post-mortem. You want to know what's going to happen tomorrow and avoid the bad things from happening. But thirdly, it's also what happens after the day tomorrow. So what's the future? What's the design, the vision that you have in there? Now, supply chain, everybody in this room knows, is actually three things. It's moving the boxes, it's moving the dollars, and it's moving information. And the next speaker that I'm going to invite on stage in a minute is going to help us to understand on what information management in the context of VAN means in there. Because it gives you a lot of information or data and value that helps you to better manage your supply chain. Within P&G, we have a very good understanding. If somebody walks into a shop and buys a pack of Pampers, what else does he buy? Is it P&G products? Is it hair care? Is it groceries and whatever? That's a very essential, important information for us that we commercially can use. At the same time, transferring that into public health, if you know if your patient who's on TB drugs and considered a chronic but stable patient, does the medicine actually do what it's supposed to do in there? This is information that you can actually get back. And some of you went on the field trip yesterday, and I think saw some examples in there. But before I go on, I would like to introduce Harshal Harkinson, who was on the panel this morning as well. Harshal and I worked together in P&G for some time. It's been, I think, 14 years plus in the company there with P&G. Harshal has seen pretty much everything in supply chain that's possible in Africa. In one of the recent roles that he had, he was overlooking the supply network for expansion markets, which is basically East, West Africa. Well, it's actually Sub-Sahara minus Nigeria and South Africa. So a big complexity supply chain that reaches from kind of buying Vic Vaporub in Mexico, Ariel from Europe, Pampers locally, big complex supply chain for him to manage. And he's going to talk to us about how we win in the market with P&G and VAN, and especially in the context of information management in there. So welcome on stage, Harshal. Thank you.
So thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity. It's an odd position to be in. I'm not used to standing in front of a podium, so don't mind me walking. It's a bit more easier. So let's get going. We're going to talk about a few things. Forecasting, the obvious. Why do we have a forecasting cycle? And then what about the general purpose of forecasting? Why do we do it? Why do we have it? Why is it so important? And then some of the challenges that most of you, if you haven't faced them, will face them. Okay? Anyone want to guess why do we do forecasting and how do you forecast? No? Let me give you an example. By design, your forecast is going to be wrong. Everyone familiar with that terminology? It's going to be wrong by design. It's just how wrong you're going to get it that's important, okay? So in reality, what you really want to do about forecasting is about taking historical events, trends, seasonality, and extrapolate them to the future. Why is that important? Because you need to understand what are you going to ship? What are you going to sell? Right? And how much money are you going to make? I'm talking from P&G perspective, but it's relevant for everyday life, okay? So this is a seasonal brand, Vicks. Everyone familiar with it? If you're not, let me know. Very seasonal. Very, very seasonal. Critical to get the supply chain right. Why? Because we have to manage the peaks, okay? Winter only comes once a year. If you get it wrong, you miss it. You miss the year, okay? From a business perspective, that's not great. We want to make sure that our transportation, warehousing has the right capacity to support those peaks, and they are massive. The deviation from the average is up to 200 to 300%. We have to have the visibility from now till next winter. What are we going to do, okay? Black Friday, big concept in South Africa. Came from the US. It's the biggest pain in South Africa at the moment. Why? Because really, it starts one day, triggers a workflow that starts almost 6 months in advance. Why? Because you have to get visibility to your supply chain as early as possible, and you start that journey by having a joint forecasting discussion with a customer. And we have a discussion that says, well, why do you want to do Black Friday with us? And we say, well, we want to deliver products to our consumers. And it starts with, okay, which product? And then we design the whole supply chain to support that one day. That single day journey starts in June. Depending on your supply chain, if you're lucky and you localize, it could start earlier, but the journey starts early. And that triggers the full flow of information through your supply chain, okay? Joint forecasting, big enabler to getting it right in the business. Why do we have a need to have a reliable forecast? Reliability is about making sure that you have data that's available, that you can make correct decisions at the right time. It's critical. It's vital to have the right forecast at all times because you're making decisions on those. Those data points are driving you to make decisions, right? The next is, from a business perspective, I have shareholders. I have to drive value for those shareholders, and I need to make money for them, right? And the business needs to grow, and we have to pay salaries. So that's quite important, right? Making sure we deliver on our shareholder value. And then last but not least, the most important part is the consumers we serve. Those are the most important people. They drive our business day in, day out. We have to get a reliable forecast to service them, okay? Financial year ends of our customers. Every year it happens. Your van is there to establish the patterns, to understand how it will impact your business model, how are you going to plan for it, how are you going to forecast for it, whether you're going to have a destocking when they do a financial year and then have a pipeline, right? Those are all elements you have to flow through. That market intelligence has to flow through your forecast, and that then flows end to end through your van network. So as we think about it, the journey starts with a forecast. It then moves into monthly forecasting, then to product SKU level. That then feeds the entire supply chain from your raw and pack supplier to your production plant to your replenishment DC. You have to get that cycle correct. And that's where the van fits in, right? The van is all about giving the visibility to the upstream information flow, which is forecasting on what's happening, true consumer demand, what is the consumption on vaccinations. You want to know just in time. When that consumption takes place, you want to know so that you can deliver the best forecast you have for the supply chain. Furthermore, supply chain efficiency is really about making sure that you have the right inventory. How many of you are sitting with more than 62 years of inventory? P&G, that wouldn't work, right? Because we're tying up the company's cash. We need to make sure we have an efficient supply chain, and both in our plants and our warehouse, to ensure that the full van is synchronized, okay? Furthermore, we want to make sure we deliver on our customers' needs and our consumers' needs. It starts with understanding what do they purchase, when do they purchase, how frequently do they purchase. And that information flow is a key enabler to delivering the forecast. So 5 years ago, we launched Aerial in South Africa, the single biggest initiative in South Africa. It took us at least 3 to 4 years to plan this, and every single pillar needed forecasting. It needed an understanding of what we were going to ship, when we were going to ship it, how we were going to ship it, and to which part of the country we were going to ship it. It started with having end-to-end visibility of what that forecast is. That is needed indeed for your van to be able to work efficiently, okay? The cycle of forecasting starts yearly, so most of us have yearly targets. That then gets disseminated into monthly targets, quarterly targets. But what's really important as you go through the forecasting cycle is to try and link the business financial planning part of it with the resources you need, okay? Because what you don't want is a disconnect where we have X that you need to deliver, but you don't have the resources in place to support that business need, okay? So the process of forecasting starts monthly, daily, quarterly, yearly, but you have to link your financial part of the business to the resources that you need, okay? Gap analysis. If you're not doing gap analysis, you need to start. It's a critical element of forecasting to understand why you got it wrong. Again, as I said in the beginning, you're going to get your forecast wrong. The question is how wrong you're going to get it, okay? So gap analysis is critical. Some of the challenges you're going to face in forecasting is, one, capability. Do you have the right people with the right skills to be able to take market intelligence, right? You get lots of data, but you need to disseminate that and change that into information that you can use. So you have to have capable, skilled people to be able to do that in a way that fits the business need and does not create a bias. So important capability building in your teams, with your people, a pillar that you need to make sure is in place, okay? The cultural part, I heard a few people talking about culture. Critical to make sure you have an unbiased forecast. In the environment we're in, we have a bias, right? Our sales and our marketing people want to ship as many cases as they could. But what do they do with the forecast is they sandbag it. They put a low forecast, you overship, you go out of stock, and then you question why you have stockouts. Well, you created the stockout because you were not sharing the information through the supply chain, right? The other one is you have a bias to over-forecast and you undership. Worst ever, you're sitting with tons of inventory, lots of cash for the business, all tied up, and then you have a situation where you could have to scrap product, right? The ultimate sin, scrapping product, the ultimate sin in a supply chain, because you've lost the opportunity to move that product through the supply chain. And this is where your van is so important, because the more information flows seamlessly throughout the van from a demand signal, which is in reality what the consumer purchases or the consumer buys from a pharmacist, or the vaccination they purchase, is really, really important to flow to get the unbiased forecast that you'd like. Then last but not least, we talk about visibility, and the van is there to enable that. And it has to, because the wrong signals trigger different decisions, right? So the better the quality of the information that you're getting at the van, the better the decisions you make. If you're not getting the full picture, the decisions you make at a certain point in time will be incorrect. So critical. You want to remove the bias from the forecast and get the best unbiased 50-50 forecast, as we call it, okay? Performance measures. If you're not tracking it, how do you know what you're doing, right? You have to have performance measures in place. We have a continuous improvement model in P&G called PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. You have to have a plan, people. It starts with a plan. You have to have a vision. You have to then have a master plan, an action plan of what do you want to do to fix the issues at hand. Once you have that, you can start to drive the continuous improvement cycle. Master data accuracy. Fundamental to make sure you do the right things on the business, fundamental to make sure the supply chain is reading all the same information across the supply chain. If you're selling something in cases in one location, but they're measuring it in units, there's a big disconnect, right? When you talk root causing, you're root causing at different levels, right? You're forecasting at different levels, you're picking at different levels. Master data, foundation, you have to get it right. Building blocks, really get to grips with understanding what drives the business, what drives the industry, what drives the sector. And that starts with understanding what do you ship if you did nothing, okay? Then what is the initiatives? What are the future plans that you see in the coming 12 to 18 months that you need to build into the forecast? Seasonality, we talked about VEX. You have to plan for those in your forecast. Critical, because the van needs that visibility as early as possible. Inventory management, critical. When you have cash sitting in your warehouse and you can't use that to drive trials, promos, events, you're losing an opportunity to bring more consumers. Segmentation is a fairly new concept, but it's coming to front because we don't want to treat all SKUs equal, right? Certain SKUs have better margin, better profit for us, and we want to make sure that we spend disproportionate amount of our time on those SKUs, because if we get those right, we'll make better business decisions, and we're going to drive the profit and the shareholder return we want. So think about in your business, in your field, what are the segmentation exercises you want to complete? How do you segment your portfolio, and how do you segment your inventory even to support that business? Types of measures that we usually have in the industry is sales performance for the current month, quarterly sales performance. Those are some of the basic ones you have to have in place, because each one of them trigger a certain action and root causing that needs to be done. Okay? So I went through that fairly quickly because I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions. But I want you to leave with two messages. One, demand forecasting doesn't need a lot of data. There's a misconception that you need to have tons and tons of data to make the forecast. Actually, the reality is you need an Excel document, a capable person, and some data points, and then you can drive a forecast. Okay? Secondly, the earlier you build the visibility into your van, the quicker they will react, the quicker they can make decisions, the quicker you're going to be able to synchronize that supply chain. Okay? Any questions?
So obviously you can't get forecasting 100% right. And one of the things I've seen with P&G is even though you may have a 95% forecast accuracy, if you back it up with really strong operations, things like warehousing and logistics, you can always counter that 5% that it's not worth chasing after.
Correct.
And still be able to deliver a perfect order.
No, I think that, and that's very relevant. I think the ongoing journey we have in the private sector is how to do more with less, how to synchronize the supply chain end to end. And that is about when the consumer actually purchases the product, how do we synchronize the entire supply chain to support that? Inventory is just the buffer for all the volatility you may expect. So I think, yes, we continue to look at inventory, we'll continue to do it, but we want to try and find a solution that synchronizes everything so that you just remove that buffer and the volatility. Okay? Any other questions? Yes.
Paul Dowling with JSI in Ethiopia. So I have a question on the van. I mean, this is not new.
No.
I mean, it's the execution of these things. What is it that's different about the van? Because it's data visibility, it's analytics, it's people, but none of it is new. So for P&G, and I know the answer is probably different for everybody, but is it like a technology that you introduced? Is it the process of centralizing decision-making rather than have decision-making diffused? Or is it the capacity of the people making the decisions?
Yeah.
And the easy answer is it's all three or four, but if you had to pick one, what is it?
Let me pick one. I think when we implemented the van in P&G, we wanted to do two things. We wanted to make sure that the people with the expertise on forecasting were situated together so that we made sure that all the skills development was in one location, and they sat next to the supply planning people so that when we made decisions, they could quickly translate that information into how it will affect the supply chain. And that was one of the disconnects we had, is because if you have too many people scattered all over the place, the time it takes between getting the market intelligence and translating that into the supply chain is just too long. So once you get a van synchronized and you have all the people and decision makers in one location, as that market intelligence flows to the van, you can quickly understand the implication it has on your full supply chain. And that's where we saw the benefit, at least in P&G, is when we got all of those decision makers in one location, the speed at which we could adjust our inventory strategy, our replenishment strategy, our forecasting was much quicker than what we've seen in the past. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, Azuka from Nigeria. Looking at what you just said, you made mention of the fact that quality of information really counts when you're talking about forecasting. So I'm looking at P&G in Nigeria, for instance, where you have so many distributors and you base your forecast on the information you get from them. How do you validate that? How do you do that in Nigeria where they are all over the place? And just give me a sense of that, please.
Sure. So when we think of Nigeria, which is quite fragmented in terms of high frequency stores, we have sophisticated tools that allow us to do geo mapping. So we are able to look at, based on how every single Palm Pilot user makes a sale, where that sale is taking place, and we then translate back that into which distributor is selling how much at what point in time, in which location. That then flows upstream to say, well, this is the demand across the supply chain, and this is where we need to push inventory based on that demand. So we have a geo mapping that allows us to get that visibility very quickly. And I think it's not uncommon, because I think if you look at even in Nairobi, we do the same thing. We have geo mapping where we can quickly disseminate what's driving the consumption and where. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Sure.
I have another question, and it relates to the panel that we had earlier and you and my discussion about. The tendency with vans is the risk that you identify a lot of data points and then just collect data and visualize it. Versus maybe you can talk a little bit about how you did the process design first to identify the metrics and then put the van on top of that.
Yeah, and I think we had this just a discussion at the break. I think it has to start with process mapping. Whatever you do has to start with defining and mapping the process you want to have. And then, as you rightfully said, is define the triggers. What are the trigger points you're going to use in the process, and how are you going to measure them, and how do you escalate those through the supply chain, okay? So process mapping is core. You have to put that as a starting point, map end to end how the process is going to flow. In the forecasting cycle you would have seen earlier, we have a very generic standard process that we follow in P&G. Month in, month out, we know the people that need to be involved. We know their decision-making powers. We know which stakeholders are supposed to be involved at what point in time. And the only way you get that is not by putting a dashboard. You have to map the process. You have to be clear on why you're doing this and what's the end in mind. Okay? So process mapping, 100% agree. It's a starting point before you get to the nice dashboards. You have to do the hard work and map it out. A few questions.
Hi. My name is Alphonse. I'm with the Global Fund, also with Unilever. So, you spoke about cash, you spoke about process, you spoke about capable people. How do you build a culture that people stay in this for years and that they really make something which makes them proud to do this van work and analytical work, to help the organization, to help the customer, the consumer, to really bring this into happiness in an everyday job environment?
Yeah, I think the culture is quite a tough one. It has to start from leadership. So what we find is it starts with senior management making, really buying into the process. And you have to get that to drive the right culture. So what we found is when you don't have senior leaders in the organization really believing in the process and the culture doesn't disseminate across the organization. So what we've done is really made sure that all our general managers across the regions that we service really, really buy into why forecasting is critical to their business, and why does it drive the supply chain, and why do we want to make sure we get it as unbiased as possible so that we can deliver on to the consumers we want to supply to. And it's a journey. I don't think it's a magic wand and you can just start overnight. It starts, but it does start with leadership, and it starts with having the right processes in place. The PDCA cycle that I shared earlier is a tool to enable that culture. It's about run to target. It's about making sure visually you can see the measures you want to have. What are you tracking? Are you on track? Are you not on track? Do people understand the rewards and recognition that's linked to that process, right? All of those are all critical elements to drive the culture you want. It's not an easy journey, to answer your question, but it starts with from the top going and disseminating it down to the organization. And I think what we also found is in demand planning and forecasting, you have to keep people in the cycle longer. So an average assignment is going to be longer than standard 2 to 3 years, because if you do that, you enable the person to really drive value. The first 2 to 3 years is really difficult because they're getting to grips with the business and the model and the work and the people. But after that, they really start to understand the business, the brands, the consumers we service. And that's also enabling that continuity of information flow. I hope I answered your question. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned the influence of cultural factor. Can you give an example of how culture influences focus?
Yes.
And the second thing is data accuracy. How do you ensure, because at the end of the supply chain, it's people that enter data in the system. How do you ensure that correct data is entered by so many people at the end?
Yeah, let me start with the cultural part. Some common cultural issues we face in the forecasting is, in many business sectors today, your forecast triggers your budget and your funding, okay? Quite familiar. And so there's an inherent bias, right? If I know that I'm going to get more money if I put the forecast higher, I'm going to leave the forecast higher. And if I undership, it's okay. I mean, we have inventory, we have a warehouse. But the culture you want to drive is a rewards and recognition of when we do the right thing and have the right forecast, how does it benefit the shareholder and end-to-end, the supply chain and the business? And it starts with the end in mind. The end in mind is, for P&G, is we want to deliver the right product at the right time to our consumer, right? So we want to make sure that the more information we can flow into the business process and the forecasting process, the more likely we're going to be able to service those consumers when they need the product. And so the cultural part is really about getting their mindset around why forecasting is important and why you need to give accurate data and how does it impact them, right? Because if you think about a salesperson, they do not want to sit in front of a buyer or a retailer being shouted at. That's the worst kind of event you could ever have, right? Because they have a promo, they have a promotion. You don't have stock, and you funded that. And the buyer says, well, I have consumers that have left my store. What are you going to do about it? So there's an inherent benefit that you need to engage with them and say, why we need the visibility. One is because we want to make sure we deliver on your customer needs and consumer needs. And how does that help you? And it needs to start with how does that help you? That's the culture you want to drive, is how can forecasting help you versus I'm telling you I need a forecast. It has to start with how can forecasting help them and the consumer we service. The second question, I think, could you just repeat it again because it skipped my mind.
Yeah, you insisted on the necessity of accuracy of data.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, it's people, many people at the end of the supply chain in every places that enter data in the system. How do you ensure that that process of capturing data is accurate?
I think it starts with capability building. Okay? In any organization, if you really want to make sure people get why it's important to give quality data, it starts with capability building. The foundation of anything you do today is starting with building the right skills and capability in the people that are going to actually do the work and make sure they understand the implications, right? As they understand the implications of that data integrity and why is it so important, they then get to buy into the bigger picture. So you have to start with building capability right to the person that captures a goods receipt note in your warehouse. They have to understand why is it critical. Okay? And once you get the understanding of the bigger picture and how they play into that bigger picture, I think you can start to drive a different culture in that organization. And we've seen it all over the world. You have to start with capability and then making sure they understand the implications.
So I think we have a question over here, and then Jim, and then I think that's it, yeah?
Is it working? Yes. So I'm Dale Sandberg. I'm from National Department of Health South Africa. I'm part of the Not On My Watch team. And I just wanted to ask, so the conversation a little earlier about the sequencing of process mapping versus dashboards and what comes first and how we do that. We've had lots of internal debates and discussions about this, and I think it would be worth reflecting a little about the difference in very fragmented, resource-limited setting, and the value that a dashboard in its simplest form can bring in mobilizing resources and in getting the buy-in and the type of culture change you're talking about now. And the danger in a complex environment like ours is process mapping, and your starting point of process mapping can be an enormous endeavor and like a bit of an endless task because things are just very, very broken and complicated. So just to flag that, I think if we were still process mapping, we wouldn't be here today. And not to say that it shouldn't be done, but just to reflect on the complexities.
No,
in
I
that way.
fully agree. I think what we found is process mapping for the sake of process mapping doesn't drive any value. Start with the end in mind. Start with what do you want to achieve. Start with the easy wins, get going, and then you will evolve. It's a continuous improvement, but you have to start with something. And take something that's really relevant, that's really important, that has a critical need at that point in time, and get it done. And get it done in the right way means process mapping, dashboards, early visibility, clear decision making, clear roles and responsibilities. Because once you do that, those early wins to the point of culture drives an inherent culture of we can do this and not on my watch, right? So you have to start, but it's important because process mapping gives you the clarity of where the issue is. It's not for the sake of process mapping, it's to understand what is the barrier that prevents you from getting to your end state. Okay?
I'll ask a question. I'm Jim Coughlin, also from the Global Fund, and we're just justifying our existence. That's why we ask questions here. So apologize for being in my rookie season still. I got a lot to learn. But as I watch the presentation, what I'm trying to see is how do we translate your story of the VIX peak season product demand to a health burden or malaria disease when it happens in that time of year. This communication where we show what a private sector does and why it relates to public health, or when you talked about leadership responsible for performance, it's because their payment and their stock options and everything else is based on that. But maybe the Minister of Health needs to understand what that responsibility means to me to help them understand the capacity building to get them. So the bridge from private sector to a reality of what the public health is solving, it's really easy. It's right in front of us, but I'm not sure we bring that across.
I think it goes to the point that was raised earlier, is start with what are you trying to solve? What is the end in mind? And there's plenty of data points in private sector that gives you plenty of learnings on how to approach these issues. Malaria, VIX, those are not uncommon. They have seasonalities. It's how you go about planning for those and how you preempt them and how, VIX season is really dependent on winter in South Africa. We have no clue what winter will look like, right? But we have to take a view. And we take a view that's educated based on all the learnings we've had, based on the history we know, and then we will have to buffer the volatility with either inventory or an urgent requirement from the plants. But you can. I don't think there's, it's not possible. I think you have to be clear on what do you want to solve and then quickly get into the routine of addressing how do you go about it. And on malaria, I don't think it's different to VIX. I mean, that seasonality is there. And it's not a difficult thing to solve, but with the right culture, with the right tools and the process and the right people, and those people are the most important because it's not me or Martin that's sitting at the back of our seats, sitting in the meeting rooms that are going to define the forecast. It's really the people in the stores and the consumption that tells us what do we need to plan for. Okay, I hope I answered your question. Okay?
Thank you
Thank you
very
Martin.
much, Harsha. A big round of applause.